Good evening. This is your 1-minute warning. If you're out in the hallway, please come in and we'll get started in just a minute. I'm not going to stand here for a minute and have you look at me, but you can talk amongst yourselves, but we'll start in just 1 minute. Good evening and welcome to our 61st Honors Colloquium entitled Democracy in Peril. Just a few housekeeping details. Exits are in the back and on both sides of the stage. The restrooms are in the entrance foyer, and we request that there be no recording, no video recording, or photos for that matter. Please also silence your cell phones. And we request very kindly, I know this is hard for everybody, but to put away your digital devices, especially when I'm looking out in the dark, that glare can be a little distracting, and we want to give our full attention to our speaker tonight. If you need to leave during the event, please close the door quietly. These doors make a little bit of noise, and refrain from speaking until you're out of the building. There's a bit of an echo in here. And now I would like to bring up Vange Hopkins, a URI student of political science and a Narragansett tribe member to do the land acknowledgement. And I'm also going to ask Vange to tell us what democracy means to a Narragansett tribe member in 10 words or less. And I will explain why, if you haven't gotten the card already, in just a bit. Okay, Vange, would you like to come up?
Askawikwasin, hello, Natasuis Vange Hopkins. My name is Vange Hopkins, and today I'll be reading the University of Rhode Island's land acknowledgement. The University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land we too inhabit. Katabatush, which means thank you. And what democracy means to a Narragansett in 10 words or less? Democracy deconstructed indigenous governments which never needed Western influence. I'll let you think about that.
Thank you, Vange. The Honors Colloquium represents and celebrates the Honors Colloquium represents and celebrates what we do best in this speaker series, which is delve into the major issues of our time and at timely moments. And what could be more timely than a colloquium on democracy during a presidential election year? This colloquium also embodies the new direction that we're heading in Honors, namely to prepare our URI students to navigate and enact change in this daunting world. Finally, the Honors Colloquium seeks to foster campus-wide and community-wide discussion. In this spirit, we are thrilled to promote partner events with the Center for the Humanities, which is a center in the College of Arts and Sciences. They're going to be running in parallel this semester and throughout the year a speaker series called Sustaining Democracy. URI Theater will be doing the play Mackinac, which is a play about female, it's almost 100 years old, this play, and it's about female oppression in modern capitalistic societies. There will be an art showcase in Lippitt Hall, put on by the Department of Art and Art History. that is the politics of personality, and it's been created specifically to go along with the Democracy in Peril Colloquium. And then you'll see with the Hera Gallery, which is in Wakefield, I believe, the Hera Gallery is running a Democracy Under Siege exhibit, and the postcards that you received ask you to state what democracy means to you in 10 words or less. And what's going to happen is that all of these postcards are going to be put on I think it's the back wall of the Hera Gallery to show what democracy means to our URI community. Finally, we are partnered with Rise Up, which is funded by 401 TechBridge, and the Student Innovation and Entrepreneurship Challenge will have the theme of democracy. So innovating for democracy. For more information for the students especially, you just need to click on the QR code right here. And then in the back, there will be Sharday Johnson and Cynthia Taylor, who will be available to answer any of your questions. Producing a series of this scope requires 1 to 2 years of planning and many campus partners. The Colloquium, I would like to thank first and foremost the Colloquium coordinators. I don't know if we have spotlight capability, but could the Colloquium coordinators stand up? Mark Hutchison. Maybe come to the front of the stage so that the light shines on you. Brian Kruger, Ashley Rundlet, Beth Mendenhall, Rick McIntyre. They've really put together an incredible series for you this semester. Thank you very much. Thanks to the sponsors for this year's program, who are all listed on our materials. We couldn't do this colloquium without campus-wide sponsors. A special thanks to the president and his office, and the provost and her office, both of whom are sustaining sponsors of our URI colloquium. Thanks to 401 TechBridge, a big contributor to this year's colloquium. And thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences for also supporting this year's colloquium. I'd like to thank also the ITS team, and particularly James, who's back there working the sound and the lights. I would like to thank our honors team for their all-hands-on-deck support. And I would like to especially thank Anna Blake, our honors coordinator, who played a central role in organizing this year's colloquium. I encourage you all to consider supporting the honors program. Besides this wonderful colloquium that both community members and students attend, donations can fund things like student projects, student travel, and student social events. Experiential learning experiences, like the cost to take students out on a research vessel in the Narragansett Bay. That's a new course that's coming. Our new project of commissioned art pieces that will portray the diversity of our honor students over the years. And I invite you to our next talk, which will be next Tuesday, at the same time and in the same place. And now to introduce Zack Beauchamp, please welcome Mark Hutchison, one of the organizers of this year's colloquium and professor of political science.
Well, thanks everybody for coming out. What an incredible turnout. I cannot be more excited to introduce this year's opening colloquium speaker, Zack Beauchamp. But before I begin, I know you're like, let's get to the speaker, but I do want to kind of give a little bit of context on this colloquium. This colloquium, titled Democracy in Peril, has been something that we've really thought about in the Department of Political Science and in other places as well. It's not just exclusive to us, for quite a bit of time. And so I just kind of want to start with the premise of this colloquium. The premise of this colloquium is that we believe that democracy as a system of government is good. It's desirable. We do not think it is perfect. To repeat a quote most often associated with Winston Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. So democracy remains the best approach that we can give to ordinary people, a say in how they're governed. Only in democracy can regular people hope to live under the laws of their own choosing. At its best, democracy can help protect human rights, challenge grand-scale private power, increase broad-based prosperity, and promote human dignity and self-actualization. Now you think, okay, it's an election year, right? This year in our country, we once again are preparing for a national presidential election, something that we have done 59 previous times in our country. It's one of the most fundamental elements of democracy. It goes back to 1789. But this year's colloquium is just not about this year's election, although it's related. This year's colloquium is really motivated by this map that you see right here. This is a map, and the trends that it portrays is something that's troubled me and my colleagues for quite a number of years. This map here shows the change in democracy across the globe. And for those of you that have ever taken a class with me, you guys know that my Intro to International Politics class, I love maps. And this is another one. This is a map that shows pretty clearly that in wide swaths of the globe, democracy is on a retreat. Now this is, for those of us in my generation, a little bit surprising. You see, in 1992, a political scientist named Francis Fukuyama audaciously proclaimed the end of history as the world witnessed the downfall of communism and the triumph of democracy throughout the world. This coincided in what is referred as the third wave of democracy. And indeed, democracy was on the upswing throughout the world and maintained that trajectory until around the 2009 to 11 era. There we saw major global recession, rising income inequality, the failed Arab Spring, uprisings, the rise of social media, and other major stressors on governments worldwide. So this map and the overall global trends that it tracks demonstrates that the world is actually generally now retreating or experiencing a retreat or a decline in democracy. According to the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance, half the world's democratic governments are in decline, undermined by problems ranging from restrictions on freedom of speech to distrust in institutions of government, to distrust in the legitimacy of elections themselves. So the number of backsliding countries, as we call them, including those of the most severe erosion, is at its peak and even spreading to established democracies right here at home. So here we are in an election year. We are once again thrown into a cauldron where we're seeing manifestations of our own polarization, angry rhetoric, and unfortunately political violence that has increasingly defined our political culture. So the purpose of this colloquium is to highlight these global trends, to raise awareness of the challenges facing democracies across the globe, recognize that the United States is not immune to some of these trends, and hopefully provide some guidance on how we can work to building a stronger, more resilient democracies at home and abroad, something that we can use to better equip to weather the challenges of the 21st century. So with that in mind, I cannot think of a better speaker to kick off this year's Honors Colloquium than Zack Beauchamp. Now, Zack is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers things like challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas and politics. He's received funding from the Pulitzer Center of Crisis Reporting to report on democratic decline in countries like Hungary and Israel, and is the author of On the Right, a newsletter on American conservative movement. He's appeared in a wide range of television and radio networks, including CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the BBC, the CBC, Al Jazeera. His work focusing on the rise of reactionary movements and populism across the West, his work on the role of identity, and his work on how fringe ideologies shape mainstream political discourse is changing the conversations across the country. His most recent book on democracy, The Reactionary Spirit, which will be the basis here, the talk tonight, just come out. And I'm really happy that Zack is here because Zack's got a little connection with Rhode Island too. Zack has earned his BA in political science and philosophy at Brown University, so welcome back. He's also earned a master's degree in international relations at the London School of Economics. And he currently lives in Ontario with his family and his dogs. So join me in welcoming Zack Beauchamp.
My papers are gone. Mark. Mark, I believe you've absconded with the talk. What's that? You've absconded with the talk. The folder with the words. Yeah. Sorry about that. Just so you all know, this is not all ad-libbed. Thanks, Mark. That was a really nice introduction, and you spoiled my opening where I was going to reveal to you that I went to Brown and talk all about how I liked Narragansett beer and Dow's lemonade and maybe drank too much of the former and maybe not enough of the latter. But that's, look, it's just really nice to be back here. It's a wonderful state. Always will have a special place in my heart. So I'm thrilled to be talking here. Now, the subject of this talk is not so delightful, right? We're here to talk about the crisis of democracy, both in the United States and abroad. And we'll start with the fact that there is a crisis, right? Now, that's not really in doubt at this point, which is a weird thing to say, right? I grew up with the United States being the icon, the paragon of democratic stability. But now, if there's one thing that people across the political spectrum can agree on, per polling, it's that democracy is in crisis, right? And that the other side is to blame, obviously. The situation is equally concerning, if not more so, among some of the world's largest and most powerful democracies. In Germany, a far-right party just triumphed for the first time in regional elections since the Nazi era. India is currently governed by a third-term prime minister who has systematically attacked constraints on his own power, worked to undermine the ability of the Supreme Court to oversee him, and restricted the free press. In 2020, Brazil just very narrowly headed off an attempt by the incumbent president, Jair Bolsonaro, to overthrow the election that ousted him. And the consequences are still profoundly shaping the contours of politics inside Brazil. So those are four of the world's biggest and most important democracies. And all of them, the United States foremost among them, is in the midst or has recently experienced some kind of democratic crisis. So how do we make sense out of all of this? Now, I've got a book, The Reactionary Spirit, that was just mentioned, and my argument in the book is that there's a central thread running through this global upheaval. It's a contest over the very meaning of democracy itself. The late 20th century saw a historically unprecedented wave of moves towards social and political equality. What's happening right now is an attack on the democratic institutions and values that enabled that wave. Now, here's the part where I tell you I'm not just going to repeat what's in the book. I will reference some of the ideas that are in there, but if you want me to just, talk about the book, I would recommend you buy the book. No, instead I want to talk about an idea that I mentioned at the beginning of the book, and I develop it a little bit, but not very much, and it's something I really wanted to write about. Now, finally, I've got a chance to talk about it with a captive audience who can't leave the room without embarrassing yourselves. And so I want to talk about this idea of democracy as a revolution. Now, normally we think about revolutions as discrete events, right? The American Revolution began in 1776 and ended in 1783. The Russian Revolution began in 1917 and ended in 1923. And the French Revolution began in 1789 and ended sometime. I don't know. Historians are still arguing about this, but it ended eventually. Tonight, I want to broaden our horizons about what counts as a revolution. I'm going to try to persuade you that we are living in the midst of a broader revolution, an umbrella revolution that encompasses many of the previous ones, the democratic revolution. It is an attempt not just to change governments, but to overthrow the basic structure of human society for nearly the entirety of recorded history. As a species, we have almost always handed power over to one person or one group of people who have then in turn determined their own successors. The idea that the people should rule themselves in perpetuity, to continue to decide for themselves who is in charge and not let anybody else do it, is so novel. So novel, in fact, that leaders of many powerful states still don't accept it. And the truth is that democracy isn't just a system of voting, right? That's not what challenges these really deeply held and long-standing beliefs. Democracy is a moral enterprise. It's one that troubles deeply held beliefs around the world about power and who can rightfully wield it. Democracy does not only set the rules for political life, but it structures and restructures the society in which it takes place along new and more equal lines. Once it comes into place, it begins terraforming the moral landscape. It's actually a bit like a volcanic eruption. It ignites the ground that it touches and lays soil for a new political ecosystem to grow up in its wake. My first task tonight is going to be convincing you of this, that we who live in democracies are not living in the natural state of humanity, but in the midst of an ongoing revolution whose outcome is very far from certain. The crisis of democracy today is really a crisis of counter-revolution. Democracy is in peril because its perpetual revolution, the heart of what makes democracy democracy, continues to unsettle social hierarchies and orders that some people, millions, even billions of people perhaps, would rather keep settled. Here in the United States, it's often hard to appreciate this broad picture, right? Because we are so saturated in democracy that we're blind to its revolutionary character. Our national identity is bound up in being the world's oldest democracy. We use elections as a governing principle as early as high school student council elections. Democracy is so sacred in this country that even our authoritarians pretend to be Democrats. They don't claim a Führer Prinzip right to absolute rule, but claim to be the legitimate electoral victors, unfairly robbed by a crooked system. Stop the steal. Increasingly, that is the norm for anti-democratic movements trying to win elections. Unlike, say, the 1930s or the 1870s, very few parties are winning elections by openly broadcasting contempt for democracy. Instead, they claim to be the true Democrats. They're standing up for the real citizens against an out-of-touch elite and their allies. This is as true in India as it is in Israel, as it is in Brazil, as it is in Hungary, as it is in the United States. The exact same rhetoric. And authoritarians use this formula cross-nationally because the first 300 years or so of the democratic revolution has been a success. Democracy does not currently have any serious fascist or communist-style ideological opponent, no rival for global dominance. In this sense, history did end in the way that Fukuyama described it. Liberal democracy is the global ideology. That just doesn't mean it's stable. And so under these conditions, authoritarian powers, or authoritarian factions, need a democratic veneer to win elections. The ability of this particular anti-democratic formula to succeed shows that we've reached the end of democracy's beginning. Finally, someone has cracked the code as to how to subvert democracy from within by promising to be a Democrat rather than from without. The first stage of this global revolution, overthrowing the ancien regime, has been largely, albeit not fully, completed. Now, my second task tonight is persuading you that this is true and that it should profoundly change the way that we think about politics. If we see ourselves not as defending a settled political order, but attempting to consolidate the gains of a revolution, the consequences for how we think about the task of defending democracy change radically. It is not merely about making sure things return to the way that they were prior to the current crisis, but how we improve democracy, not only to make it more equal, but to make it more resilient. And at the end, I hope to offer a few thoughts on how to do that. Just a brief sketch. But first, I need to convince you that democracy is indeed a revolutionary project. So what, you might reasonably ask, could that possibly mean? Now let's start in the most literal terms with the, I should have slipped to that before. With the one slide that I want to show you tonight. I promise we're not going to belabor it too much. This is a chart of the number of people living in democracies and autocracies around the world beginning in 1789. Autocracy is at the top, you can see in red, and in yellow. Blues are democracies. They're different kinds of democracies. They're not important for present purposes. We'll talk about them in a second. The key thing is look how short the time with blue is in that chart. Look how recently we've had democracy at all, anywhere, let alone democracy is something that billions of people lived under. I mean, that's an artifact, looking around the chart, eyeballing it, of really 1945 on. And in fact, in 1945, according to VDEM, which is the institute that this data comes from, there were just 12 democracies anywhere in the world. Anywhere on the planet, just 12. Now, by the time the clock chimed midnight on the night of the new millennium in 2000, about half of all countries were democracies. Today, democracy is the only political system to have outposts on every populated continent. The world's richest and most powerful country is a democracy, as it is largest by population. That's remarkable. Right? Stop and think about it. Since 1945, democracy conquered the world, just that quickly. Really by the turn of the century, so more like in 55 years. No political system has gone from nearly extinct to world-spanning, I mean ever, let alone over the course of just a mere 55 years. Now let's go further back in time. The earliest records of human civilization date back to around 3,500, 4,000 BC. So we've got about 6,000 years of humanity where we know that we had civilizations and organized political rules. And for the vast bulk of those 6,000 years, no democracies anywhere. That 1789 is there for a reason, right? Creation of the American Constitution. Prior to that time, there were almost no, and probably really no democracies by modern standards. So take ancient Athens, for example, often held up as the classical paradigm of democracy. Athens had pretty strict rules about who could vote. Only about propertied adult men could participate in the franchise. That's about 10% of the population. Now, as a point of comparison, that's slightly less than the percentage of citizens who are allowed to vote in apartheid South Africa. So this is not really much of a democracy that we're talking about, at least by modern standards. Now, all of that is to say that democracy as we know it is new. I mean, very, very, very new. But whatever folks over in Silicon Valley say, newness does not mean that it's revolutionary. What makes democracy revolutionary is not just that it's replaced authoritarianism or various kinds of authoritarianism as the dominant global political structure, but that it's revolutionized the way that we think about our societies and the way that we relate to them. Older forms of authoritarianism weren't just systems of government. They were moral theories about the way that things ought to be. These theories say that certain people deserve to govern and certain people didn't, because of facts about who they are. The Chinese dynasties, Mayan kingdoms, European aristocracies, and Indian caste hierarchy operated very differently. Different rules, different theologies, different local circumstances, all sorts of differences. But what they shared in common was a sense that humans could be divided into distinct groups, and your membership in that group should determine your fitness to participate in the enterprise of governance. And in all of those systems, that was likely unchangeable. You couldn't become a king. You had to be born a king. Democracy's core claim is that that's false. No one deserves to rule for any other reason other than winning the trust of their fellow citizens. Political authority comes not from God or tradition or an accident of birth. It's from humans and humans alone. Voting is not the ultimate purpose of democracy, but it is the mechanism that democracy turns its moral ideal into reality. Democracy's modern founders, revolutionaries in every sense of the word, understood their fight against Europe's monarchies in precisely these moral terms. The very first article of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man declares, quote unquote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. The nature of this general good, the document continues, may only be determined by the people and their representatives, as, quote, no body nor individual may exercise any authority that does not proceed directly from the nation. The foundation of French democracy, the first of its kind on the European continent, is the abolition of the political principle of hierarchy in favor of a distinctively democratic vision of equality, one in which natural rank does not exist, and the only inequalities that can be tolerated are the ones people determine to be acceptable consequences of political freedom. That's a pretty radical idea, and it remains so today. And the thing about radical ideas like that is they're difficult to contain. The French learned that very quickly. Haitian Revolution of 1789 had many causes. The precipitating event was with little doubt the revolution happening in the colonial metropole. As the French people overthrew the Bourbon monarchy, the residents of the colony began wondering what that meant for them. At the time, as a little bit of background is important to understand this part, Haiti was divided into three racial castes. The whites sat atop with the wealthy landowners, called the big whites, wielding the most power. The largely enslaved black population sat at the bottom, and mixed-raced individuals, collectively called people of color or just the colored population, were somewhere in between. They weren't systematically enslaved like blacks, but they were nowhere near accorded the rights of the white population. Toussaint Louverture, the black former slave who had become the revolution's greatest leader, describes the uprising's progression as an outgrowth of the interplay between Haiti's racial caste system and French revolutionary ideas. In a 1799 letter to a French government minister, he writes that the first successes obtained in Europe by the partisans of liberty over the agents of despotism were not slow to ignite the sacred fire of patriotism in the souls of all Frenchmen in Haiti. Note there that all Frenchmen includes the black and colored citizens. For Louverture, it was important at this point in time especially to emphasize that he saw himself as part of the French polity, not seeking independence or the overthrow of the government, but seeking participation in a democratic system. However, he noted in the letter that the local whites didn't share his view of how things should be. They maintained an obstinate, quote unquote, obstinate refusal to allow the people of color to enjoy their political rights and the slaves to enjoy the liberty that they claimed. This, per Louverture, was intolerable, forcing, quote, the men of color and blacks to unite themselves in order to claim their political existence, and even take up arms after the whites denied them the rights and benefits of the revolution. Now, that's a little bit of a favorable portrayal of what happened to him in his cause. The historical record's a little more complicated. Allegiances shifted a lot between different groups. Racial groups fractured amongst themselves and fought each other as well as members of other groups. Everyone committed atrocities. Louverture himself, while in power, was one of the more morally responsible leaders, but he was also quite authoritarian. And in 1800, he issued a forced labor decree that dragged many blacks back to plantation servitude. So this isn't a situation where it's there's good guys and bad guys, clearly cut, simply put. But there was a right side, a right set of claims, and a wrong set of claims when it came to including certain people and excluding others based on democratic principles. And Louverture identified, I think, really clearly how much democracy's revolutionary principle changed the way that Haiti worked. When the French rose up to declare that no one deserved to rule another without their consent, their slaves took them very seriously, demanding that France treat them as citizens worthy of rights. When the white French authorities resisted by force, they sought and ultimately achieved independence. That's really what turned Haiti into an independent country, that they wanted rights as Frenchmen, didn't get them, seceded. When a democracy is marred by inequalities at odds with its own principle, it foments demands for consistency, demands that are either accommodated through the electoral system or else become the source of social upheaval. We can see the same dynamic at work in another 19th century democracy, one whose history I think you're a little more familiar with. In his forthcoming book, American Dark Age, the scholar Kedrick Roy argues that the antebellum American South is best seen, at least in ideological terms, as an outgrowth of European feudalism. This, he argues, is not an anachronism imposed by modern-day historians, but the self-conscious doctrine of the Southern slave owners and their allies. They would frequently compare themselves to European feudal nobles, the slaves their serfs. Interestingly, this was something that the abolitionists agreed with them about, perhaps the only thing. Roy documents a school of thought, he calls it Black liberalism, theorized by figures like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, which described the project of emancipation in terms of freeing the United States of any remnants of feudalism. Douglass, for example, wrote that he aimed to purge American government of, quote, everything that looks towards monarchy, including, quote, all discriminations against any person, theoretically or practically, with the ultimate goal that America would be a place that would, quote, keep no man from the ballot box or the jury box or the cartridge box because of his color, and exclude no woman from the ballot box because of her sex. Notably, Douglass wrote these words after emancipation was achieved. His view was not that the end of slavery was mission accomplished for American democracy, but the beginning of a long march towards becoming what he termed a genuine republic. Keep that phrase in mind, I'm going to come back to it. Democratization for Douglass was not an endpoint, but a process, an ongoing American revolution. Now, before we go forward, I want to be clear on something. I am not arguing that Haitian or American slaves were incapable of understanding the immorality of their own oppression without the aid of democracy as an ideological toolkit. That's absurd. Rather, I am arguing that the spread of democratic ideals inspired people to seek redress for those ills through politics. It created the conditions where political power is no longer determined by hierarchy, that social power may not be truly centered in just one group, and thus, as a consequence, opened up space for people who thought politics may have been foreclosed to them. When a society proclaims that all men are created equal, this might be one in which equality was not just an abstract ideal, but a possibility. We've seen this dynamic again and again with different social groups. I focused on race and slavery, but you could just as easily talk about the 19th century rise of the organized labor movement, 20th century feminist movement, the Stonewall riot. Throughout American history, citizens have worked to make the ideals of democracy closer to a reality by voting, by protest and voting. Nor is this merely an American phenomenon. Really, it's a universal one throughout democracies. And I think there's a quote from the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson that really identifies this element of democracy, this core of its ideal, which is, she defines it as, collective self-determination by means of open discussion among equals, in accordance with rules acceptable to all. To stand as an equal before others in discussion means that one is entitled to participate, that others recognize an obligation to listen respectfully and respond to one's arguments, that no one need bow and scrape before others or represent themselves as inferior to others as a condition of having their claim heard. Democracy for Anderson is about creating the social conditions under which that ideal could approximate reality. Merely formally abolishing ranks and distinction isn't good enough to create open discussion between equals. If it had been, then formally emancipated sharecroppers would have little to complain about. Democracy is about equality in a deep and substantive sense. The work of its perpetual revolution is using law to dismantle hierarchies that force people to bow and scrape before others in political life. And that means that democracy's rapid rise across the world in the 20th and 21st century, what you see on that chart, is not merely a story of authoritarian governments falling apart. It's not just a story of red turning blue. It's a story of that lighter blue, electoral democracies, democracies that tend to have weaker rights protections, turning into that darker blue, liberal democracies, which they define as democracies that make social equality into not just an abstract ideal, but something that is a fabric of laws, right? They may not be perfect countries, they never are, but they're ones in which that take democracy's ideas seriously. That change shows that once democracy gets its claws in, once it takes root, it begins its process of revolutionizing the societies which it has just taken over. The work is relentless. It happens, and it has the potential to change everything, but that doesn't mean it always succeeds. And here, on both counts, I want to turn to another example, a more recent one, Israel in the 1990s. While Israel was founded as a Jewish democracy, it was beset by an essential contradiction. How can a state be at once a democracy and a state for only Jews? This was a country that achieved unprecedented social liberation for Europe's historically most oppressed population, while at the same time keeping its Arab citizens under military rule until 1966. The very next year, after the 1967 Six-Day War, it began occupying Palestinian-populated land without granting the residents citizenship. Even among Jewish citizens, inequalities persisted between European-descended Ashkenazim and Middle Eastern-descended Mizrahim, and between Orthodox Jews who controlled the chief rabbinate and set the terms for things like marriage law, and basically everybody else. In the 1990s, a movement emerged to bring Israel closer in line to what Douglas would have called a genuine republic. In 1992, the Knesset, Israel's parliament, adopted a new basic law. Basic laws are the functional equivalent of a constitution inside Israel, though it doesn't have the same level of force. The new basic law, created a series of enumerated individual rights. Each were intended to ensure that Israeli citizens were protected against government overreach. The purpose of this basic law, the Knesset declared, is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to embed the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state in a basic law. This basic law and another enacted around the same time transformed Israeli jurisprudence. Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak famously termed it a constitutional revolution in a 1992 speech, a view shared by many others in Israel at the time. For the first time, the Israeli state had provided its courts with clear tools to strike down Knesset legislation in the name of human rights. Moreover, the laws gave the Supreme Court authority to decide what it meant for Israel to be a Jewish and a democratic state. Barak, who would later become the court's president, had a pretty clear idea of what that meant. He believed the state is Jewish, because, quote, not in a religious sense, but in the sense that Jews have the right to immigrate here and that their national experience is that of the state. That means Israel should use Hebrew as its official language, make Jewish holidays official holidays, and grant Jews abroad special rights to immigrate. But other than that, Barak argued, Israel's Jewish identity should be understood in terms of Jewish values, which are more or less liberal democratic ones. The fundamental values of Judaism, which we've bequeathed to the whole world, are our basic values, he said in the speech. I am referring to the values of love and humanity, of love of humanity, sanctity of life, social justice, doing what is good and just, protecting human dignity, the rule of the lawmaker, and other such eternal values. There was, for Barak, no real contradiction between Israel's Jewish identity, described in these terms, and its democratic identity. In fact, he argued the state's values could now be understood to include equality in a legal sense, which was not anywhere in the basic law itself, but he argued, I think plausibly, implicit in its vision of society. Now, the court under Barak did little to challenge Israel's greatest injustice, the occupation of Palestine. But it is not an accident that at the same time that Israel is reforming its legal system, it made the most serious push for peace in the country's history. The Oslo Accords, a pair of agreements signed in 1993 and 1995, augured an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or at least people thought so at the time. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat agreed to mutual recognition and a two-state solution to the conflict. The Accords created the Palestinian Authority, an autonomous Palestinian political entity that would govern Gaza and the main population centers of the West Bank, as a kind of transitional step towards full independence. So why did Rabin do it? Why did he agree to give up land that Israel had conquered? Because. Why? Well, in an October 1995 speech to the Knesset, he argued that two things were needed to ensure a healthy future for Israel: to first and foremost retain a large Jewish majority, and at the same time to ensure that non-Jewish citizens enjoy, quote, full personal, religious, and civil rights like those of any Israeli citizen, because Judaism and racism are diametrically opposed. Any attempt to hold on to the Palestinian territories indefinitely would, in Rabin's telling, fatally undermine both of those objectives. Today, after innumerable wars and bloody incidents, we rule more than 2 million Palestinians through the IDF and run their lives. This is not a peaceful solution, Rabin said. We are convinced that a binational state with millions of Palestinian Arabs will not be able to fulfill the Jewish role of the State of Israel. The centerpiece of Rabin's case for peace was thus the same concern for democratic equality that motivated Barak's constitutional revolution, but applied to an even more fundamental problem. In Rabin's mind, Israel simply could not survive as a democracy while ruling undemocratically over Palestinians. Forced to choose between equality and hierarchy, Rabin opted for the former. The perpetual revolution of democracy had come for the inequalities that persisted and had come to define the Israeli state. Today, we know that this attempted revolution failed. In November 1995, an anti-Arab radical named Yigal Amir shot Rabin after he delivered another speech calling for peace. Peace talks collapsed about 5 years later, giving way to decades of violence and occupation. Israel is currently governed by its most radical government ever, one that is simultaneously attacking Israeli democracy at home and mercilessly slaughtering Palestinians in Gaza. The dream of two democratic states coexisting side by side feels further away from ever. Yet Israelis haven't given up. Last year, when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempted to seize control of the country's judiciary, ordinary Israelis organized the largest sustained protest movement in the country's history, successfully preventing what they accurately termed a judicial coup from becoming law. And just a week ago, they staged a rally for a ceasefire in Tel Aviv that eclipsed even the protest movement of last year. It was the single largest protest in the entire country's history. These events, to me, illustrate why it's so important to see democracy as a revolution that has moved past its first stage and is now experiencing a new kind of counter-revolutionary pushback. Oftentimes you hear the current crisis of democracy described as a global democratic recession by such vagabonds as Mark, my introducer. This metaphor suggests that democracy is in retreat everywhere, shrinking in a manner akin to global GDP during a worldwide recession. Now, that might be true, but there are some reasons to doubt it. In a new paper, political scientist Andrew Little and Anne Meng studied a series of objective indicators that can be used to assess the health of democracy worldwide. Things like whether an incumbent had recently been defeated and voluntarily departed office. They found counterintuitively that there is little evidence of backsliding on these variables in the last decade. The rate at which voters sent incumbents packing had barely budged since the late 1990s, suggesting that a lot of democracies are actually doing quite well, thank you very much. But something unusual is happening right now. A crisis of democracies in countries where it seemed relatively established. Think about the examples that I've been talking about so far. Israel, the United States, Brazil, India, Germany. To that list, one might add Hungary and Poland, countries once considered the great success stories of the post-communist wave. These are not fragile or poor countries. They're either middle income or solidly in the developed world, with decades or even centuries of democracy under their belts. you can see a little bit of how bracketing those countries matters in this chart. Now you see there's a little bit of a line here, right at the very end, most recently, where the light blue dips into yellow, that seems to be that billions of people all of a sudden, very rapidly, no longer became living in a democracy, and we're now living in an autocracy. Now that's exactly what it shows. In about 2021, VDEM, the institute that does this, changed their coding. They counted India as not a democracy anymore. India makes up that entire decline. That's all India, right? It's just because India is so big that it has an outsized effect on a map on a chart that's done by the population, the number of people living in a democracy. Now it's worth noting that VDEM has been widely criticized by India area experts for this. Most scholars of India believe that India still remains a democracy, and I think they're right about that, just one that's in a lot of trouble. But I understand why VDEM did what they did. The lines are really blurry. And the reason that they did that also is that something new is happening. Democracy isn't declining everywhere. It's that democracy is unusually imperiled in its heartlands. And they wanted to highlight that. But there's also something this chart doesn't illustrate, that the case of Israel does. So does India, for that matter. That the threat is overwhelmingly coming from one side of the political spectrum. Now, it's not that the left can never threaten democracy, or even that it's lost its ability to do so. Just look at Venezuela, or even contemporary Mexico, to see cases where left-wing factions have emerged as threats to democracy. Nor is it that conservatism is necessarily opposed to democracy. It is not. In fact, healthy conservative parties are essential for a democracy to survive and even thrive. Your speaker next week, Dan Ziblatt, has written an excellent book on this, Conservatism and the Birth of Democracy. When you listen to him talk, and I recommend you do, I would like one of you to ask him about it. It's a good book. But look, any honest tally that looks at well-established democracies under threat right now will see that most of the threats are emerging from right-wing factions. This is a matter of contingent fact, not necessity. It doesn't have to be this way, but it is, and that brute fact requires some kind of explanation. This is where I think the notion of democracy as revolution is so helpful. If we understand democracy as an ongoing revolution, we should begin to expect greater anti-democratic resistance from the right when the workings of that revolution become especially visible, because that revolution tends towards equality. The left, in theory, supports equality. The right has some concerns about moving to equality too quickly. It's the fundamental nature of the left-right divide, and has been since the term was coined during the French Revolution. Left-wing factions tend to become democracy under different circumstances. Left-wing factions tend to become anti-democratic under very different circumstances. It's not when democracy is succeeding at delivering equality, but when it's failing. When democracy is seen as hypocritical and unable to deliver on its own promises, that's when the radical left flourishes. But when democracy is working in the way that it's supposed to, when it's taking people who are on the margins of society and giving them rights and treating them as people who, as Elizabeth Anderson would say, no longer have to bow and scrape in order to be heard, that's when you get right-wing authoritarianism. And this impulse for certain factions on the right to move against democracy in the name of fighting equality is the titular reactionary spirit of my book. The impulse to respond, to move toward true democracy by attacking democracy itself. It's particularly powerful now, I believe, because the democratic revolution has been so successful since the end of World War II. Again, chart. And even inside those blue countries, it's been eroding hierarchies of race, gender, caste, religion, class, and ethnicity at a pace with no parallel in human history. It's not just that democracy has spread so quickly in these past 80-odd years. It's that what democracies have done to themselves, the way they've changed their own self-understanding to be in line with Douglas's notion of a genuine democracy or a genuine republic, that's triggered this crisis. The most reactionary movements today are beginning to amass a mass audience by playing on the fears and uncertainties created by this truly revolutionary moment in history. Not just the past few years, the past several decades. Now, you might reasonably ask for evidence that this impulse is at the heart of the current anti-democratic political moment today, to which I will reply, buy the book. There are enough historical case studies and large N regressions in there to satisfy even the most hardened nerds in the audience, and I know you're out there, this is a university talk. But for now, I'm going to ask you to take it on faith. Democracy is in peril because of its success at delivering on its own core revolutionary project. I need you to trust me on this one, at least for now, in the Q&A, have at me, so we can get to the next stage of the conversation. What should we do about it? Now, my answer is straightforward. Give democracy a chance. Too often, I think democracy's defenders display a certain sense of panic about the system they claim to champion. And this varies, the nature of this panic, based on their political persuasion. So a certain kind of liberal calls for the government to get more involved in censoring speech, which they call misinformation or Russian propaganda, specifically speech they don't like. Some moderates rail against quote-unquote wokeness, whatever that is, and call on pro-democratic political parties to give up on their fundamental political commitments, like, say, the idea that the United States should remain a country that is relatively generous towards immigrants. Such responses can, in limited and narrow cases, be appropriate. There's a genuine problem with foreign interference in American elections, and in certain rare cases, dangerous forms of violent incitement gives the government legitimate cause to censor speech or intervene in social media conversations. And there are surely cases, like a member of Congress running on a race in unfavorable terrain against a truly heinous opponent, where winning might demand compromises on pure principle. This is politics, after all. Nobody remains pure. But I worry about seeing these things as the first resort, not the last one. And some recent political science research suggests that going too far in these directions, treating them as the first resort, really could be a mistake. Several studies suggest that disinformation in social media is not actually a major driver of either democratic decline or polarization in the United States, a finding that should make us very wary of proposals about censorship to fix democratic decline. Another body of research suggests that mainstream European parties that have adopted too much of the far right's platform on immigration have actually increased far right parties' vote shares, basically by legitimizing their rhetoric, by saying, oh, if it's okay to think that, I might as well vote for the people who really hate immigrants, not just the people who are pretending to. I call these kind of proposals a product of panic because they involve, in one way or another, a proposal to betray democracy in order to defend it. If we understand democracy to be an ongoing revolutionary process towards equality, one that depends on open public debate and free elections to ensure that the march towards becoming a genuine republic continues, then we should jealously guard both free speech and public policies that embody democratic equality. We should also see those values as primarily working in tandem with each other, not coming into conflict in the way they're often portrayed in popular media accounts of the culture war. So instead of embracing a panic-driven democratic betrayal, we should commit ourselves to a course of action rooted in faith in democracy. We should start from the premise that democracy's defenders enjoy certain advantages in the ongoing political contest with the reactionary spirit, namely, that they won the first part of the struggle for democracy's survival. In fact, Democrats won so effectively, here I mean people who support democracy, not the partisan Democrats, that most people living in democracies around the world, per cross-national surveys, still believe that democracy is the best way to organize a society. This finding shows up again and again, and it always strikes me as remarkable. Because you see all these survey results that say people's trust in government is at an all-time low. They're losing faith in their government's ability to deliver. And yet again and again, they say, we still like democracy. We believe that power should be determined by elections, not by one-person rule. There's nothing like the backlash you saw in the 1930s against democracy. Democracy itself remains a viable ideal. People just want a better version of it. In the long run, the playing field is stacked against the authoritarians, not their democratic rivals. But that doesn't mean that democracy's victory is inevitable. It just means that its defenders need to take action. And they need to do so by making the case for democracy, damn it. In my book, I know several recent cases, the 2022 Brazilian presidential election, the 2022 US midterms, and the 2023 Polish elections, where campaigning on democracy proved essential to defending democracy. The candidates really focused on these issues, the ones when they were facing opponents who wanted to undermine democracy, and they won. It was critical to stitching together coalitions, and I'll be happy to tell you some of the details in the questions. I've also recently argued in print that there's more room for pro-democracy rhetoric as well in the 2024 presidential election. But there's one last thought I want to leave for you guys to ponder. It's that democracy is not just it's not about what prominent political actors do. At its heart, democracy it's about you. It's about ordinary citizens going out and doing the work of persuading others. During elections, that might mean phone banking for a candidate who you believe embodies democratic ideals, or volunteering as a poll worker who ensures that elections are conducted fairly. In between elections, that might be engaging in the hard activist work required to change minds and mobilize people toward the democratic cause of equality. Democracy is not a revolution happening despite us. It's a revolution of us. Its brilliance and its beauty lie in its ability to take millions of people and devote them towards the shared purposes of collective self-government. It takes discrete individuals and turns them into a political community of equals. If democracy is to survive the end of its beginning, its citizens need to remember that they are its authors, and then get to writing. Thank you.
So we're going to now turn into the Q&A section. We have two folks, Brian Kruger and Ashley, who will go around with microphones. We do ask that we leave these at questions, not statements, not with, and Zach will try to answer them. I know we went a little long with intros, so we'll do questions for about 10, 15 minutes. Sounds good? All right, so with that, I'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you very much. Could you describe the differences and some examples of the liberal democracies, the electoral democracies, and the electrical autocracies?
Yeah.
It's a great chart.
I got you. It's confusing. So let's go back to the slide. A liberal democracy, I think archetypally, Canada is a very good example, a country that has very, very few problems in terms of formal equality inside its political procedures. One might add the United States, that we're moving away from that direction. But think of a country that has a very well-established democracy with strong rights protections for its citizens. That's a liberal democracy. An electoral democracy is a country like India, where there are democratic procedures, elections are fair, but there are systematic inequalities and problems with governance, be it corruption, be it attempts to suborn the freedom of the press, that weaken democracy's functioning, that also restrict the formal rights of some of its citizens. An electoral autocracy is a country that has trappings of democracy, but in reality is an authoritarian state. Here, I think the archetypal example is Hungary. They still pretend to be a democracy, they have elections, but the structure of society is so fundamentally arrayed against other political parties than the ruling ones that no election is possible. And a closed autocracy is a country where there are no pretenses about it being democratic or not. That's China or Russia.
In your book, you talk a lot about how social changes in regards to race contribute to the reactionary spirit, Hindu, Muslim, India, Palestine, in Israel and stuff. But one thing I'm wondering about is gender. How is the recent rights women have gained, Me Too movement, how is the social change in regards to gender inspired reactionary spirit in both US and the other countries?
Great question, and the answer is profoundly. One thing that you find that's very consistent in reactionary movements across the world right now is an insistence on traditional gender roles and on their value and on a sense that something has gone badly wrong when men are no longer men and women are no longer women. Leaders will often brag about their masculinity. One of Narendra Modi's advisors like to talk about how Modi had a 58-inch chest, which I don't believe is literally true, but was a metaphor that was used after he bombed Pakistan to show how manly he was. And in the United States and Hungary, as two other good case studies, there is real sort of overriding preoccupation with the birth rate and a sense that government needs to be reconfigured to try to get women to have more babies. At the same time, there's no calls for, let's say government subsidized childcare in the United States, nor is there a sense that men should be doing more work at home. So what is the implication of this view? Well, someone has to do all that child rearing work, and since they exclusively encourage heterosexual relationships, it's women, right? Really, I call this doctrine, I've read about it a bunch recently actually, neo-patriarchy, right? It's an idea that you don't want to say that women should go back in the home, but you really want women to be back in the home, right? And this is, I think, much of the political grievance animating many reactionary movements across the world. And I don't enjoy doing things that are like, well, race mattered X much and gender mattered Y much and class mattered Z much. because these kind of things are very difficult to calculate in anything approximating precision. What I will say is that the sense that the feminist revolution has gone too far and has changed our society in a way that makes people unhappy is really central to reactionary politics today. Fundamental. And if you're curious for evidence, I invite you to go spend a little bit of time on Tradwife TikTok, and you'll see exactly where this leads.
So, sorry. How would you respond to the sort of mass proponents of anti-electoralism, particularly among more liberal and moderate people who essentially believe that if they cannot vote for a candidate who supports their exact ideology, they should not vote?
Well, I would say that's not how democracy works, right? In a democracy, you have choices, right? And those choices are somebody who is better and somebody who is worse. And sometimes you don't have a binary choice. So I guess I will add, I think we should have more options in our political system. There's a political scientist named Lee Drutman who has devoted his career to making the case for America becoming a multi-party democracy. And I think Lee's right about that, right? That we would be better off if our political institutions were reformed such that, instead of AOC and Joe Manchin having to share a political party, they could be in different ones. Instead of Mitch McConnell having to spend time with Donald Trump, they could be in different factions, the business-friendly conservatives and the MAGA types. These are just very different political people with different political agendas that have to cooperate with each other because of the way our system functions. That's a problem, right? It's a real issue with American democracy. That's not to say that there aren't other problems with other systems, but just that ours is imperfect. But in the one we have, you have a binary choice, right? You have to pick one of those two people, and you have to make a calculation based on your own views as to which one of the candidates in the two-party race that you're thrown into is the better one or the worst one for advancing your slate of interests. And everything is relative. It's a purely utilitarian decision. Otherwise, what you're doing is functionally giving a vote to the person you like less. And so I just think that there's an element of that view that I sympathize with, and an element of that view that's a studied refusal to acknowledge reality.
Adding on to that, with the existence of third-party candidates, and I assume there are examples of other democracies where there's multi-party or there's more than two. I honestly don't know a lot about them. What would you say are, I know this isn't necessarily what you gave your talk on, but what are the steps towards attaining a multi-party democracy?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot in books about democracy, so it's totally not out of bounds. I didn't include it in my book for a reason that I'll get to, and I think it'll be obvious after I'm done talking. Basically, what we need to do is to change the way our elections work. We need to move away from a winner-takes-all system where whoever gets the largest number of votes wins the elections, and that's it, into a proportional system where elections are determined, the amount of seats are determined by the percentage of the votes that you get. So let's say if you win 55% of the votes in Florida, you'd get 55% of the House seats as opposed to whatever happens in a gerrymandered election or 100% of the presidential electoral college seats. Can you do that inside the US electoral system? Yes, you can. And the way that you do it without totally changing the Constitution is something that we used to do but don't do anymore, which is multi-member large districts. So basically shrink the number of districts in the House, keep the number of representatives the same, and then make it so that in each district, seats are awarded proportionally. So you end up getting something, you could even make the district the size of the entire state if you wanted to. This is something Congress can do with legislation. And then each state would have its House members apportioned proportionally. Is this a good idea? Yeah, seems like a great idea. Is this gonna happen? No, absolutely not. It's just, there's no way you can imagine Congress doing this. So I really, much like in the last question, I sympathize with the political scientists who close their What's Wrong with Democracy books with we should have a multi-party democracy. They're right, I agree with them. Great idea. But okay, it's not gonna happen in, as ever, maybe, like, certainly things would have to radically change, right? And more specifically, the problem that they are trying to solve, which is that extreme political polarization has thrown democracy into crisis, is exactly what makes it impossible, right? Because the two sides can't agree on how to fix the system because they all think that a reform proposed by the other side means that they will benefit. So nobody will pass anything that they think will benefit the other side. Good government under these circumstances, these kinds of like sort of public-spirited reforms, become functionally impossible. So pitching them as a solution is basically proposing a catch-22. It's not to say it's not a good idea, just somebody needs to spell out a much more persuasive pathway other than like the legal workings, like a political pathway as to how we could get there.
Hi there. One question I have is, you speak about some of these issues, like the fact that there are very few legal frameworks in place to achieve things like electoral reform, for example. Another example I can think of is with our Social Security and Medicare in this country. Currently, the systems across this country are about 10 years away from bankruptcy. And the problem with this democracy is created is it is so focused on pleasing people and campaigning to people and being a reactionary political institution that it is ill-serving the country, because these are really difficult decisions, and there is absolutely reasons to argue for both sides, including economic pressures that are affecting so many people in this country. But the thing I want to ask is, if there are so few legal pathways, this is sort of addressing the counter-revolutionary side of this, is do you believe that some groups that are certainly radical, I personally agree with some of the examples you've given, like the supreme judicial reforms in Israel being a radical form of anti-democratic movement for the consolidation of power, is that, do you believe that some of these movements do have merit to them based on the failures of some aspects of liberal democracy?
So I don't think that there's ever been a political movement that hasn't gotten some aspect of reality right, right? They're not just all totally in fantasy land. They emerge from somewhere and exist in a context where the things that they're saying to people make sense. So yeah, I think there are significant failings in government. I think in the Israeli example, there are real problems with the way that it currently appoints its own justices. There's a problem with insularity, because the judges kind of pick themselves in a way. There's a problem with representativeness. There's a concern about the court's relationship to democracy. I think in the United States, there certainly are some major issues with how our democratic institutions function. In India and Hungary, the authoritarian leaders in both countries won power the first time through free and fair elections, largely because they were running against deeply corrupt parties that were currently in power, that had taken advantage of the system. Now, of course, they're more corrupt than the people that preceded them. But the point is that in all of these cases, there is not just a monocausal story of what went wrong, and there's not just a they're bad and they're evil and they're irredeemable, what is even the point of these people, why do they exist? When I talk about these as being movements that are defined primarily by an antagonism to equality, I'm talking about what is sort of the core grievance of the movement, what attracts the largest number of people to it, what makes it tick, what makes it a powerful political movement capable of marshaling rabid support, be it really, well-attended large rallies staged all the time, or people who are willing to go to the mat in the legislature in order to transform the nature of democracy itself. That's different from saying they don't have any good ideas, or there's nothing that can be learned from these things. And if you would, if we want, we can talk about different aspects of the Trump policy agenda in the United States that I like. And there are certain things in there that I myself don't disagree with. I don't believe that they, on balance, make a persuasive case for tearing down American democracy, for overthrowing an election that was clearly legitimate, for turning Israel into a country where there is no check on the power of the elected majority to do whatever it wants without constraint for minority rights, and on down the list, right? My criticisms are rooted in on-balance judgments. They're not a blanket statement that this thing is bad.
We are at our last question.
How do we overturn Citizens United?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
How do we overturn Citizens United?
You don't. You get the Supreme Court to have different people on it. That's what you do. Or you pass a constitutional amendment, which is impossible. So lots of things are wrong. I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to override you guys. That was a short answer.
Do you believe in America?
I'm going to give an even shorter answer. Yes.
Okay. I want everyone to join me in thanking Zach for such a wonderful and provocative thought. This is really great. What a wonderful kickoff to our colloquium. So we are going to now close tonight. I want to just point out for all of you that have your cards to defining what is democracy, we've got Carl. Carl, raise your hand. Carl is collecting the cards. So if you'd like to deposit them with Carl, that would be great. Otherwise, we really look forward to seeing many of you throughout the semester. Thank you once again.